A person might construct their view of God upon three possible foundations: via negativa, via analogia, or via eminentia. Via negativa means by way of the negative. The way this applies to God is that it assumes we cannot say what God is, we can only say what He is not. The assumption is that God is too great to describe and define in affirmative statements. Proponents of this view often say, God is totally other. Those who prefer this foundation would not refuse to say that God is righteous, but they would say that it is not possible to describe God's righteousness in accurate positive terms. They might say that righteousness means that God does not lie or God does not sin. Everyone admits that an exhaustive description and definition of God is beyond our intellectual scope. But this does not support using via negativa as a theological foundation. One soon runs into serious problems when using this as a foundation. Most of the time, you cannot declare what something is not unless there is sufficient information about what it is. For example, if I were to ask you what color my car is not, you can only provide a confident answer if you know what color it is. Via negativa is not a sufficient theological foundation. We turn to via analogia, which means by way of analogy. This approach emphasizes what God is like, but assumes we cannot say what God is. Again, the assumption is that God is too great to describe and define. Consequently, we can only use similarities and comparisons. Those who prefer this foundation would not refuse to say that God is righteous, but they would say that we can only speak of God's righteousness in terms based upon our experience with righteousness. They might say that there is a similarity between what our experience informs us and of God's righteousness. But it is not sufficient to accurately describe His righteousness. Again, I would admit that an exhaustive description and definition of God is beyond our intellectual scope, and that analogies are often employed and very useful. But this does not support via analogia as a theological foundation. If we solely operated according to philosophy, we might justify its use as a foundation. But we are aiming for a biblical theology. Though Scripture uses analogy, it does not suggest that everything revealed about God is an analogy. As a foundation, via analogia is insufficient. We then turn to via eminentia, which means by way of eminence, superiority, or supremacy. From this foundation, our basic emphasis is that God is supreme. We then allow scriptural data to inform us regarding His supremacy. In reference to a moral attribute like righteousness, we learn from Scripture what righteousness is, realizing that in regard to what we learn, God is supreme in righteousness. It's not that it's so totally different that we cannot know what it is, or that it's simply similar to what we learn. It is the same kind, but a different degree of righteousness. I am not claiming that this is the magically perfect theological foundation, but it offers a flexibility that allows Scripture opportunity to truly inform our minds. Though admittedly the human race is in a fallen condition, we must remember that God created our minds and prepared Scripture to be perceived in great measure through the processes of our minds. This is the theological foundation I find preferential. Just a word on kind and degree. The two geometrical images you see on the screen are the same kind of shape with a different degree of size or capacity. The same is true in reference to God's relationship with man. God chose to create human beings in his own image. We can see the attributes and characteristics of God and man in this way. When we learn something from Scripture regarding the attributes and the character ascribed to God, we also learn something about God's design for human beings. If we honor his design, we express such things in a finite fashion, knowing he is supreme in each area. This sets the stage for studying the nature and character of God.